The lady just behind.
Thank you. Salome Samedashvili, Ambassador of Georgia to the European Union. I have a question. Mr. Sikorski, you have mentioned that the measurement of Europe's global role is, first of all, in your ability to influence the neighborhood and solve the problems in the neighborhood. At the same time, you are not alone in the neighborhood. There is certainly competition around. And I would like to know what is your assessment in view of that, of the project of Eurasian Union, which seems to be championed by the new old Russian president, and which seems to be actually the policy which for a change might have chances to succeed. Do you think that this is the challenge to the global role of the European Union? Thank you.
Thank you. This gentleman right at the back there. This will be the last one, and I'll come back to our panel, and then we'll take another round after that.
Thank you. My name is Reinhard Bütikofer, a member of the European Parliament. My question goes to Senator Shaheen. Senator, you emphasized that the transatlantic security relationship should be developed within NATO and seemed to be disparaging to some degree sort of the EU CSDP efforts as building parallel structures. Now, I would question that sort of description, but don't you see anything positive in the EU's effort of developing its own capacities? If you think of Atalanta, for instance, which many experts consider to be a relatively successful effort so far, and cooperating not only with the US, but also with actors like Russia, China, India successfully?
Okay. What I'm going to do is, I mean, six, I think, very interesting questions, but on a lot of different perspectives. So what I thought I'd do is I'd ask the panelists to choose one or two from those, although there are one or two specific ones, that last one in particular. So let's even, what, Mr. Krastev, pick
yeah.
your...
No, I'll start with the question of Brooke Jackson, and basically the problem is what really has changed, at least what is my reading, because the good story about crisis is that different people are reading differently. One of the things that is going to change dramatically is how the foreign policy is done. And in my view, there are two things which are going to very much change. When you have austerity state, which basically means that what we did in the last 3 months is that economic decision-making is taken out of the electoral politics. It was constitutionalized, budget deficits and others. If this is the case, what remains in politics, it's foreign policy and identity politics. And people are going to be much more involved in the foreign policy because this is where parties are going to compete. What we see as the result of the crisis, because we have been talking a lot about democracy, authoritarian capitalism and stuff like this, what I see is the emerging of two different versions of there is no alternative politics. In European Union, there is no alternative policy. On economic issues, you can change governments, you cannot change policies. And I do believe that this is very well seen now in the Southern Europe. In places like China and Russia, you can change policies, you cannot change governments. There is no political alternative. I do believe this is a totally new way of structuring, because we have two types of rigidities which we don't know how they're going to work. And this is my problem with the European Union. People are now fixing what's wrong with Lisbon Treaty, if you're going to change article this or that, if we're going to elect a counter and not appoint him, how it is going to work. The biggest problem is what is happening on the level of the member states. And for me, one of the really alarming things which I see is the following. See how the European public reacted to the Arab Spring. The public, we're not talking about politicians, we're not talking about journalists. In 1989, the change in Eastern Europe opened the democratic imagination of Europe. Western Europeans get the hope that they can transform the world around them. What I fear is that in 2011, Arab revolutions opened the demographic imagination of Europeans. We started to fear how the others can change us. And this is why I do believe that we should try to start to be curious in others, because we're not in the world in order to remake it simply to be another European Union. Unfortunately, I don't believe that we have a capacity for this, and also probably we don't have a clear vision for this. Probably we have the values and visions is not the same. So from this point of view, starting being interested in others, but also interested in ourselves, what politically is happening? How publics are going to react in this new situation in which they can change governments more and more? And by the way, they cannot change policies. My last point is, from this point of view, Eastern Europe, by the way, is going to be an interesting thing to reflect on. Because what is going to happen and be the major characteristics of European democracies in the time to come is very much going to resemble East European countries in the time of transition and accession. Constrained democracies. Certain type of policy decisions are not going to be there. Certain type of austerity state is going to stay for a while. In Eastern Europe, the truth is that it worked. Basically, it managed to do it. Is it going to work on the level of the European Union as a whole? In my view, this type of questions should be asked. And this is not a question about the optimal currency zone.
Okay, that's great thoughts. I mean, is it better that you can change your politicians and not your policy, or you can change your policy but not your politicians? I'm not sure who wins in that contest, or perhaps they're both losers. Mr. Lambsdorff, do choose from that sort of menu of questions, but can I ask you to address, as Germany took a rather different view on the Libyan question. There may be Germans saying, well, we told you so. I don't know. But what about vision for Europe? Where is it going to come? I mean, there must be. Germany has set, if you like, the economic terms of trade for the European Union. You know, everyone has to follow the model set by Germany. Where's the broader vision?
Well, you asked us to pick questions. Now I have Libya and the German economic model. I try to bring this into one answer, which is going to be a bit of a challenge. But let me say, first of all, that on Libya, I'm a bad spokesperson for my government because I fundamentally disagreed with our voting behavior and our behavior in this crisis, full stop. I think this was, with Gaddafi marching on Benghazi, we were in the process of seeing a second Srebrenica. I think we should have voted with our allies in that particular situation, and I've said so publicly before. I think that was not very helpful. However, I do not think that Europe has abandoned Libya. And I do not think that Libya is a lost cause where you can't go. I fully agree that Libya is a handful. It's a challenge. And the structures in that country make it extremely difficult with the Constitutional Assembly to be elected in June and the process going on afterwards. But Europe is fully engaged in helping that, as are, by the way, the Americans with NDI, IRI. I mean, all the democracy support institutions that are there. USAID is there. Our development assistance people are there. So I do not think for a minute that we have abandoned Libya. Does that mean we will be successful? Does that mean that Libya is going to turn into Switzerland? I don't think so. But it's going to be a process, a joint project with the Libyans to get this country back on track. The other issue, however, is one that has to do with a couple of questions concerning the crisis, a north-south divide, etc. And let me say one thing here. For all the talk of the north-south divide, I believe we should pause for a moment and think of those countries in the north that are in the euro with a lower GDP per capita than, say, Greece, who are asked to help. I mean, we as Germans, we are asked to help as well, but our GDP per capita is a lot higher than Greece. I see Thomas Ilves over there from Estonia. Hi. The president of Estonia. That is a country that joined the euro rather recently, and we should, pay credit to Estonia for doing this in these difficult times. They have a lower GDP per capita than Greece, but they're still asking their citizens to pay for the stabilization of the Greek economy. And I think that shows you that talk of a north-south divide, because it's hard to think of something more northern than Estonia, perhaps except Finland, is probably not all that pertinent. However, what Ivan just said, I think, is really important. Our democracies are changing. The old model of democracy that goes for the United States, it goes for Japan, it goes for Europe, was we finance electoral victories with promises that are very difficult to finance, if not impossible, and we then pay for these promises by running debt levels that are unsustainable in the long run. This has to end. this is ending now, and that is something where in the United States you have the problem. In Japan, at 226% of GDP, they are out, loaning us all. And if that means now that austerity is the name of the game for a couple of years, well, yes, that is a change in democracies. I thought your thoughts were extremely original, but I believe that the Greek election already in April is going to tell us whether you're right, that you can only change the politicians but not the policies, or whether the Greeks will make a policy choice that may be unexpected. But looking at the polls right now, we can expect a government there that is going to make some fundamentally different decisions from their predecessors. So I think the real issue is, are Western democracies capable of changing their ways with public finances in a way to come to sustainable fiscal public policy?
Fascinating argument. I think most people, though, would buy into austerity for a couple of years. I think what most people fear is it austerity for 5 years or 10 years? And that's a question. But, Minister, there were one or two direct questions to you. And
well, first of all, about this business of North and South. I don't believe in determinism. It used to be argued 100 years ago that it was really a distinction between Catholics and Protestants. Catholics supposedly incapable of creating market relationships and competition and so on. And yet, in Europe, for many decades, the two richest regions were Northern Italy and Bavaria. Now, is Northern Italy south? Is Bavaria north? I'm not sure. I think it's all to do with policies that you pursue. If there hadn't been labor market reforms in Germany under Schröder, with some weaknesses in the German banking system, we could be having this discussion about Germany today. And then when you look at how you fix it, well, one way is to complain about foreigners, is to complain about the euro, or you just bite the bullet like the Latvians did, who had a minus 20% GDP recession in 2009. They did what it took without rioting, and not only have they fixed their country, the government was re-elected. And the depth of your recession will probably be in proportion to the amount of time you lived above your means. Sometimes you pay for the sins of your predecessors. But as regards the Eurasian Union, I would say that I agree with Ivan, who says that Europe is now perceived to be weaker than it really is. We have talked ourselves down. By mishandling the euro crisis, we've created the impression we've lost more of our soft power than perhaps we deserved. But it has implications. It means that it's easier to say Europe doesn't matter, we don't want to go that way. And so, for example, today we took a decision on sanctions against Belarus. It's a pity, because I would have preferred Belarus to tend towards Europe rather than to tend towards Central Asia. But it's partly to do with the loss of our civilizational attractiveness, and with Russia having the financial muscle through the price of hydrocarbohydrates to be able to subsidize a project of integration around herself, which I think is in the long run not going to be that good for Russia, because Russia could do what Turkey has done, which is to say, use the process of approaching Europe as a not substitute, but as a means of modernizing itself legally and in other ways. But yes, it's a challenge. It's when you make mistakes, sometimes your neighbors pay for them.
Senator, one specific question to you. Shouldn't you be grateful that we're doing something on defence? You know, we may not be spending any money, but at least we're trying to get together. Or is it all duplication, as you seem to suggest?
Well, first of all, I speak for myself and not for the State Department. So just to be clear on that, and I didn't intend.
No.
You think it's on? Okay. I speak for myself and not the State Department. But I didn't intend to disparage EU efforts around security and defense, but was really thinking about it from the perspective of the financial constraints that Europe and the US is facing right now when it comes to defense spending. And thinking about how we can better cooperate to meet our security challenges rather than each country needing to buy X number of missiles or planes or helicopters or whatever it is. So that's really the context in which I was commenting. And it really brings me back to the comments about how do we deal with the debt and deficits that we're facing in the United States, that you're facing in Europe, that we're having a debate about what's the best way to deal with that. And in the US, the question is, are we going to deal with it by cutting and solving all of our problems on cuts, or are we also going to look at how we raise taxes to support that and how we reconfigure some of the programs that we're providing to people? And I think one of the things that I have looked at with some questioning has been the one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with the debt crisis in Europe. Because as I look at what we need to do in the United States, we absolutely need to deal with the debt and deficits. We can't continue as we're seeing here with borrowing. But we also have to grow. And we can't just cut and continue to cut. We have to figure out how we can grow our economies at the same time. So having a plan for dealing with the debt, as well as figuring out how we continue to invest in our people, in infrastructure, and the other things that we have to invest in, I think are critical. And it's a lesson that I think we all need to learn.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open it up again. This is Global Europe. This session is about, and I'm just going to. I'll leave a thought with people who may want to speak. We haven't really mentioned. No one's really mentioned China, India, Turkey, even. So I just leave that out there. But the gentleman there, who. Yep.
I'm Charles Grant from the Centre for European Reform. I wanted to try and link together the euro crisis and the security questions concerning Europe. It seems to me that the euro crisis can't be resolved without a lot of centralisation of decision-making. The worry is that the people who live in many Eurozone and other European countries aren't really keen to see that centralisation, which makes it not 100% certain that the euro will survive intact, though I happen to believe it will. If it does survive intact, there's going to be a lot of slow growth, economic misery, and I think that political elites will have to learn to listen much more closely to voters than they have done. They're not going to be able to build great constructions over their heads. In terms of foreign policy, this means much less support for enlargement. It means much stricter controls on immigration. And it means much less support for defence budgets because defence spending is pretty unpopular in most European countries. Those budgets are going to decline anyway because of the need for austerity. So my suggestion is that the euro crisis will damage Europe's hard power quite a lot to make it less ambitious to intervene in other parts of the world, because although governments won't be populist necessarily in the terms of being hard right or hard left, mainstream politicians will have to respect voters' wishes much more than they have done. I regret.
Okay, thank you. If you just, this gentleman sort of 2 rows along, or two seats along.
Masaishi from Japan. This is being propagated by Philip, but for me, the meaning of the euro crisis is a reminder about how much influence Europe has on the economy in Asia, particularly in China. China got really worried, as you have noticed. We are worried, And then because China got worried, we are more worried. So I think my message is, yes, you do have an influence, and you have established interrelation, very happy and peaceful interrelation with Asia. So be ready to use it and be confident, continue to get involved in problems, not to be part of the problem.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, China plays a very good game of dividing and ruling in Europe, so does Russia, actually. But there's a gentleman here.
Thank you very much. My name is Bahadur Kaliagasi. I'm from TÜSİAD, Turkish Business and Industry Association. Well, Europe globally has certainly still lots of power in the Fortune 500 company lists, in research and development, in the global finance. So it is still a global power, but after all these episodes of financial crisis, and as also seen from outside Europe, there is a need for a certain success story. I don't know where it can come from, of certainly not in Afghanistan or in security-related areas where Europe is not yet well-armed institutionally. But how about the G20, WTO, climate change, digital economy? Where can we really look for a feasible and influential success story in the short term? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman at the back there.
I'm Bob Bennett from the United States. I've not heard in any of this a mention of a force that I think is very dramatic in terms of Utah's future. Slip, sorry. Old habits die hard. In terms of Europe's future, and that is demographics. You talk about the Europe as a global power. Within the lifetimes, the careers of the young people that I'm currently teaching, the entire Europe population will be less than the American population. The size of your GDP will be less than the American GDP, and it is driven by the European birth rate or lack thereof, and the American ability to absorb immigration, even though our birth rate is at replacement level, so that the American population will grow significantly. Demographics is destiny. Demographic trends are the hardest to change, and no one in this panel or in any of the questions has raised the question of what is happening to Europe's position demographically, and where will we be 15, 20, 25 years from now when these lines that I have described cross. The American economy and the American population will both be bigger than the European economy and the European population. And what impact will that have? And what challenges does that recommend for Europe with respect to its attitude towards immigration and its ability to absorb immigrants as an effort to deal with the shrinking percentage of its population that is of working force age?
Thank you very much. It's a very good point. Why is it the United States sees immigration as an opportunity and we see it as a threat? The gentleman here, here, and here. Now, I'm making life really tough for the panel, but it just strikes me that it's good to get as many people as possible in, so if that's okay.
Quickly, I just wanted to pick up your...
Name?
Andrew Khan, Nomura. I just wanted to pick up your challenge on China. The chairman of the Chinese Sovereign Wealth Fund was quoted a few months ago as saying, when asked whether he would invest in European bonds, European infrastructure, European companies, said, why would I want to invest in a country with excessive old-fashioned welfare states where people don't work? Which was a tough reply. I was in Beijing.
Sounds like a Republican.
Yeah. I was in Beijing last week talking to a number of quite senior people, all of whom were very interested in what was happening in Europe. They were very focused on the challenges of Europe. But what struck me was they had no interest in Europe as a regional entity, as a political grouping. They saw everything in terms of the member states. And the question I'd put to the panel is, how can we engage Chinese interest in Europe as a political entity? Something which they've strongly resisted doing up to now. Is there any way we can do it, or are we condemned to relate to China as member states?
And in the front, the penultimate.
I'm Jim McDermott. I'm a member of Congress from Seattle, Washington. I want to pick up on the military questions that you raised because somebody said that with excitement that you were getting rid of the draft in Germany. We got rid of the draft in the United States in 1975. We now have a professional military. We have a professional military that is drawn from one strata of the society, really, and it is exhausted. We don't have enough people, so we're reaching out to Europe to go with us on all our adventures. And my question is, does that mean, we know that the military likes to have a professional. They don't want to deal with draftees because they're always a problem. I was a problem in Vietnam back in the distant past. They don't want guys like me. They want people that have volunteered and have committed themselves to be soldiers. Now, is that going on all over Europe? Are we going to have all the Europeans going to be professional armies that will be able to be sent by the governments without much clamor from the population because they're gone? In the United States, nobody knows anybody who's in Afghanistan or Iraq for the most part. And so you can run those kind of wars using a professional army. And I'm really trying to understand what's going on in the European situation as you get drawn in. I mean, we got Mali now. Now, what should we do about Mali? And there's going to be a continual call to NATO allies to come and support the things that we're doing in the world. And I'd like to hear, just to understand what's going on in Europe.
Thank you. This lady.
Thanks very much. Zania Dormandy, Chatham House. I'd like to pick up on the earlier vision question, but look at it from a slightly different perspective, and ask the panelists, how do you get over this huge stumbling block that is sovereignty? You know, why is it that we've been unable to get beyond the euro crisis? A lot of the arguments, a lot of people are saying, well, you have to have a closer political union in order to have the closer monetary union. Why is it that we haven't been able to work more effectively in a military sense? Well, because in the end, every government wants its own military that it can order to do X, Y, Z, and is wary of giving up capabilities because the Brits aren't sure that the French will let them use the carrier group if they need the carrier group, and vice versa. And so my question for you is, what is the impetus, if you will, that will allow the European governments to get beyond this big issue of sovereignty and come together to create a mutual Europe that will then be able to deal with China as one entity rather than independent entities who at some level compete with one another?
Thank you. I suspect, given the time, that's probably our final round. So I'm going to go back to the panelists. I mean, a whole host of questions, and right at the end there, a very core question about sovereignty. It's something that we can't really bypass, but lots of interesting things about our attitudes to immigration. Why are we so frightened of immigration when we're all getting so old? About whether we're turning inward more generally in terms of enlargement, in terms of defense, whether we do have anything to offer China with our perhaps some people would say over generous or over expensive welfare states. What I propose to do, if it's okay, is to go in the reverse order from the beginning. So start with the senator and go from there.
Well, I want to go to Bob Bennett's question. I hope he wasn't raising the issue of family planning, since we've been talking about that a lot in the U.S.
15 minutes.
Yeah,
that's it. That's why I said it was the last. Yeah.
You know, he makes the demographic point, which is an issue not just for Europe, it's an issue also for the United States and for the Western world as we look at what's happening in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia. And clearly, we need to think about that. And I don't have any magic answers. But we are not going to have in the U.S. the workforce that we have counted on, which is, generally white between the ages of 30 and 50 that has been the primary focus of our workforce for most of the last century is not the future workforce. The future workforce is older, it's immigrant, it's non-white, and we've got to figure out how to adjust to that and to do it in a way that ensures that those workers are educated and trained for the jobs of the future, that we figure out how to deal with our immigrant population. And I don't think the answer in the United States is to send them all back. I don't think that's the answer in Europe either. And so we've got to do a much better job of figuring out how we integrate immigrants into our societies and think about how they become our future workforce. Because if we don't do this, it's very clear that we will not be able to compete with China, with the emerging countries in South America and Asia. And so we need to really think about how we're going to handle our future.
Thank you. Ivan.
I want to go to the demography question, and I find it really critical, not simply in terms of numbers. There is this beautiful novel by the Portuguese Nobel Prize winner, Saramago, who tells the story of a country in which suddenly people stopped dying. In the first 2 or 3 months, there was euphoria. Everybody was really euphoric, but then first the church was troubled. Because if nobody is dying, nobody can resurrect. And then basically the insurance company went to the government and said, but probably nobody is dying, but we are dead. And then the pension funds. And then all these people that have been taking care of a sick old people who are not dying and not dying, they organize a kind of a mafia in order to smuggle the sick people to the neighboring country where you can die. At the end of the day, the prime minister went to the king and said, if we not start dying, we do not have future. I'm saying this because one of the interesting stories about Europe is that the major question that Europe is facing now are the question that China is going to face in 20 or 30 years with their one-child policies. And if there is something where Europe can lead, it's basically we are the first to meet some of the problems that others are going to meet later. Demography is becoming critical for European politics. I have been doing some study on the populist movements in Europe. This is not people who remember the past. This is people who fear the future. Because they know all the demographic projections. They know what's going to happen to their ethnic group. And you have this new player, the threatened majorities. Majority groups that have the feeling and the fears of minorities. I do believe this is a totally new situation. And I very much agree with Charles Grant on this. What we are seeing as the result of this crisis is dismantling of the welfare democratic state in the way we know it from the Cold War period. In the level of the radical change, it's very similar to what happened to our countries after 1989. Why, for example, Germans believe that it can work in the way it worked? I do believe part of the answer is also concerning Eastern Europe. Because what most of the Europeans learned out of East European transition is that you can have unpopular economic policies without a populist political backlash. And secondly, that you can have intervention, political intervention in the sovereign countries, but this is not going to delegitimize democratic institutions. Why? Because of the anti-establishment sentiments. The reason European Union is so much liked in Bulgaria is not because Bulgarians know what is the vision of the European Union, but because Bulgarians slightly mistrust their own political elites. So you have these much more difficult questions coming up, and I do believe Italy and Mr. Monti and what's happening in Greece. So this is a new situation. And I do believe in this new situation, the worst that can happen is to pretend that nothing has changed. And if we're not going to change the way we're discussing what's happening, I do believe we're going to not simply look weaker in the eyes of the others, we're going to become weaker because we're going to become slightly more stupid.
Thank you. Mr. Lambsdorff.
Well, I just briefly say something on demographics and then come to the issues of hard security. There's a little town in the southwest of Germany called Schwäbisch Hall. The southwest of Germany, you should know, is the most industrial region. Mercedes is from there, and Porsche is from there, and Bosch is from there. They're all from there. So they don't have enough skilled workers. So they put ads in a Portuguese newspaper telling people about how beautiful Schwäbisch Hall was and teaching them German. And 1,000 Portuguese came to Schwäbisch Hall. And I think this is what we're going to see increasingly, competition for skilled labor inside the European Union, but then we will have to move beyond the EU. And on our doorstep, we have huge reservoirs of young people looking for a chance to take their lives in their own hands. I mean, in Northern Africa, if you look at the demographic structure there, you have a completely different thing. And the big challenge, really, and Senator Bennett, of course, is absolutely right, is our ineptness, really, at handling immigration in a way that is productive for our societies. I mean, that is something we still haven't figured out to do right, but we will have to do it. As far as hard security is concerned, Charles, and to your questions, the first one and the last one, they tie in together. The real question is, what's the impetus? When are member states finally going to wake up and realize that we cannot continue in this way, that we do it member state by member state? What few people know is that Europe has more soldiers under arms than the United States. We have about 2 million men and women in uniform to the Americans 1.4, I believe it is, 1.2, 1.4 million. We spend only 60% of what the Americans spend on their soldiers. That means that we get much less bang for the buck. I mean, we are much less effective. The German armed forces, for example, was about 250,000, but when 8,000 were deployed, the entire system was creaking already. Huh? So the issue is we really need to get our act together. What can change that? One, and there, Charles, yes, you may be right, that the austerity measures are going to make it more difficult to increase defense spending, but it may also lead to a recognition that more cooperation is needed. And I think that's partly what's behind the Lancaster House Agreement, frankly. The Brits and the French simply don't have the resources anymore to have a full spectrum military, each of them, given the need for austerity. That's one driving force. The other driving force, and I really do not wish for it, but I'm just putting it out here, is an external shock. The Iranian missile hitting Iran, or what have you. I mean, I don't want to speculate here, but the outside shock is going to focus people's minds quicker than perhaps anything else. But for the time being, the lack of trust between nations and the rather comfortable financial situation that we were used to over the couple of decades have prevented Europe from getting its act together there, and maybe things are changing for the better. As far as the draft is concerned and that situation, I believe that the numbers are going to shrink, but the effectiveness is going to go up. In Germany, Britain, and France, these are the three nations where I know we have professional armies, or we are about to have professional armies. In Germany, we've started in July. No, we have just started a couple of months ago, actually. I don't know how it is in Poland, but I think for many European countries now, the draft is very difficult to justify in terms of the lack of security and outside security threat. In Germany, for 20 years, we've maintained it, although we were surrounded only by NATO allies and European partners, with the exception, of course, of Switzerland, neither in NATO nor in the EU, but not an existential threat to Germany's territorial integrity.
Thank you, Minister Sikorski. Minister.
Oh, well, we abolished the draft 3 years ago as well. It's not just easier to send volunteers to war. It also makes sense with more modern equipment. When we were drafting people for 12 months, even 18 months, takes 6-9 months to train them in the use of modern equipment, you get very little use from them. So it's much more sensible to keep people in the army for a few years. On demography, it's a little unfair to castigate Europe as not being a mecca for migration, because that's a US speciality. You were founded by migrants, and integrating migrants is what the United States is best at. And we're not, because we are a densely populated continent with some historic nations and strong national identities. And I also think that we've now come to the end of a certain argument about migration, namely, because we can't afford our social protection systems, we have to have mass migration. And I think thanks to the crisis, we've discovered that if you want to fix your social protection system, you fix your social protection system. We are extending our retirement age and no longer relying on somebody else doing the work for us. And that, I think, is also partly a solution to the issue of shortages of labor. But I agree with you that there is now much more labor mobility inside the EU than people anticipated. It's, one of the arguments about the euro not being a natural currency area is that there's little labor mobility. Well, tell that to the 1 million Poles who've traveled to Britain, to Ireland, and are now coming back. And one more point to what Charles Grant said. You're absolutely right that in a democracy you have to listen to your electorate. But it also works the other way. As politicians, we can actually take leadership and start explaining things to our people. And public opinion is not something fixed. You can change it by making persuasive arguments. And I wish politicians in Britain would make persuasive arguments about the utility and the destiny of Europe as a great power.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Minister. Yeah, taking leadership, it's all about that. Now, I've got about 10 pages of notes from which I've summarised this brilliant discussion, so I was going to sort of offer you that, this summary, but I decided that you made like a cup of coffee, so I'm going to say 3 things from this brilliant, rich discussion. 1, it's clear that the game isn't over. 2, it's still clear that we, as Europeans, need to find a better way to organise our team. And 3, maybe as Minister Sikorski said, we need a new, more powerful manager. But I think the most important thing is we should thank the panel and everyone who contributed. Thank you.
And thank you, Philip. I especially want to thank Senator Shaheen for bringing in an excellent congressional delegation. Yes. We'll recognize them one by one over the next few days. I'd also just like to remind everybody that the first big delegation that we had here was brought by Senator Bennett. So it's great to have him with us today. And I'm glad that he got to ask his question about demography, because I've heard him speak more than a few times on that. We're going to take about a 15-minute break for coffee, and then we'll be back. And a big thanks to all of you. It was terrific.